So, what are fallacies, why are they useful, and why do I appeal to them so often whenever I'm making videos? Well, today I'm going to be getting into that as well as tackling a few of the ones that I think you're most likely to encounter when engaging in conversation or discourse. So, let's go ahead and roll that footage. Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, you should probably go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell notification icon, because I said so. And considering that I know what's best for you, I'm an authority on that, I'd say that it is best for you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. Now, most of you probably caught on that what I've just engaged in is a type of fallacy. This is the appeal to authority. Basically saying that X is true, or I should do X because an authority told me so. For one, I'm not an authority on anything, except possibly screaming at Adobe Animate when my lip sync doesn't work. Speaking of that, anybody know how to set up Visames? Having trouble rigging up a new avatar mouth. Anyway, if you'd caught on to the fact that there was something wrong with the way I was appealing for you to click the subscribe button, then you've already demonstrated the use of understanding how a fallacy works. Now, you don't have to engage in a bingo game with fallacies where you plot every single time somebody thought wrong on a map. I do it on my channel because that's just the style of presenting content that I try to do. But in normal conversation, you might not want to word it that way. But at the end of the day, understanding various fallacies can help you in your everyday life. If you know why the reasoning behind getting to a particular conclusion is wrong, you can avoid being convinced by charlatans who are trying to use faulty reasoning to get you to conclude something themselves. For instance, if someone tried to sell you colloidal silver and argued that many doctors support the medical benefits of ingesting colloidal silver, much in the same vein as the example with the subscribers, you'd already know that this is an appeal to authority fallacy. Appealing to an authority who actually has a lot of study on a topic is not fallacious in and of its own, but arguing that the truth value of a statement, so the medical benefits of colloidal silver, is in any way contingent on the word of an authority figure, or even worse, when the authority figure you're trying to use in a particular scenario actually has no expertise on the topic at hand. In both cases, someone is engaging in the appeal to authority. Anyways, now that I've prefaced that, most of you already know we're getting into fan art, and then we're going to get into the video itself. Alrighty, first of all, we have a pixel art Suris face by Arioria, and then we have a purple plate Suris by Snow, leading into a mecha Suris by Valkyrie. As always, thank you all for your fan art submissions, and let's begin. I already went over an example of why you would want to understand how a fallacy works, but suffice it to say, the real reason why it's good to know fallacies is because even a weak argument can be very persuasive if you aren't familiar with the reasons why the argument is weak. Fallacies will not tell you if a conclusion is right or wrong. In fact, arguing that a conclusion is wrong because a fallacy was used in coming to it is called the Fallacy Fallacy of all things. No, what a fallacy is for is helping you realize why the reasoning behind an argument is wrong. If we use the appeal to authority again, if I say that the sky is blue because my mom told me the sky is blue, the sky could be blue independent of whether or not my mom actually told me that, but by appealing to my mom as an authority, I've engaged in the fallacy. The conclusion can still be true, but the reason that I got to the conclusion is wrong. You've probably noticed somebody do this in your everyday life, and that's why today we're going to go over about 10 fallacies you're probably going to come across, so that hopefully you'll be able to spot them. So first off, let's get into one of the most common ones you're probably going to find, and that is the Strawman Fallacy. This is what happens when somebody oversimplifies or misrepresents your position or your argument. They are setting up a straw man in order to make it easier for them to attack or refute it. Like with all fallacies, your position could be strong or could be weak, but via the straw man, someone can reason themselves into believing that your conclusions are wrong by making your argument infinitely weaker than it actually was. When someone engages in the straw man, it is usually intentional, and it's done so that somebody does not have to fully address your actual argument. Most of the time, whatever straw man they present to you will look similar to your argument, but much like a stool, it may be missing some really fundamental legs to stand on. It's still a stool, you can still recognize that it's your stool, but they've given it back to you without some fundamental pieces required for it to be as sturdy as it usually is. They also might add extra pieces to the argument that you made that weaken it further, further that aren't actually things that you've said. For instance, if I say I want to hire a painter to take care of the walls in my house, and one of my partners retorts with, "Oh, so you don't think I can handle it then?" They've now presented a straw man of what I've said. I wanted to hire a painter. I did not give the reasons why, but the reasons that they gave for me hiring a painter weakened the reasons why I would want a painter. The reality could be that I would just rather us go out to eat while the house is being painted. Please note this is a hypothetical and not an actual situation that's happened. This next fallacy is one that most people who are familiar with politics have probably been presented with 1,000 times, and it is the false dilemma or false dichotomy fallacy. This fallacy is engaged in when somebody presents a complex issue in terms of only two opposing sides. Like with the Strawman Fallacy, they strip away any nuance arguments from these two sides might have, or any other options that one might have besides these two, in order to present someone with the false idea that they only have one of two choices, and they might even be strawmanning both of them. As an example, if I say I don't want Donald Trump in office, and then somebody responds with, "Oh, so you want Biden," they have engaged in the false dilemma fallacy. No, I don't want Joe Biden, and I also don't want Trump. There are other options. How realistic it is for any of those options to be considered doesn't actually factor into the equation. Not wanting Trump does not automatically mean that the extreme of wanting Joe Biden is true. This can also generally lend credence to extreme stances, ignoring any opportunity for compromise from any particular faction. For instance, if you presented a totalitarian oligarchy and somebody said that the only answer is totalitarian control via communism, they would be presenting you with a false dilemma. This is because there are other options on both the right and the left besides totalitarian versions of either economic system. But when somebody presents you with the false dilemma, they are arguing almost in an ultimatum type of way that your only choices are A and B, and that if you choose a negation of B, you must necessarily want A, even if you might not want either system, or in my first example, either presidential candidate. This next one exists in several forms. It's the hasty generalization fallacy. Much like with the false dichotomy, this requires ignoring any nuance in a particular situation in order to come to a conclusion very, well, hastily. There are a couple ways this can happen. One version of the hasty generalization fallacy is to take information you know from a small portion of the population and apply it to everyone. If you met a particularly toxic MGTOW, or a men going their own way type, he might have been burned by one or two females in his life and then argued from that point forward that all females are bitches, vultures, and generally horrible people who have all the power in the world. Conversely, you might have a radical feminist who's had the same thing happen but with the opposite gender and then argues that all men are shit afterwards. In both examples, we've seen somebody engage in the hasty generalization fallacy. It can also come in forms of explicit racism. Say you grew up in a bad neighborhood and had black people steal from you and therefore concluded that all black people are thieves. This is, again, the hasty generalization fallacy at work. You've taken information from a small subset of the population and expanded it far past its scope. This would also make it a scope error, but we're not talking about those yet. Now we should probably look at the exact opposite of the hasty generalization fallacy. This one is called slothful induction. This occurs when you have sufficient evidence for a particular proposition, and with that sufficient evidence, it indicates a very particular conclusion to be true, but you refuse to acknowledge it or fail to acknowledge it. Whereas with hasty generalization, you have very little information and make broad, sweeping conclusions based on that lack of information. With slothful induction, you have plenty of information and refused to make a conclusion. For instance, if I have an employee who is late every single day consistently, and this has been happening for 2 years, via slothful induction, I can chalk it up to random circumstance. For 700 days. I have plenty of reason to understand that there is something else happening. He could be a lazy employee. There could be abuse happening at the home, preventing him from getting there on time. I don't know his situation, but my refusal to come to any conclusion about it is an exercise in slothful induction. This is one you've probably heard me talk about pretty recently, a lot, every single time somebody brings up statistics. This is the correlation-causation fallacy, also known as post hoc, ergo proctor hoc. If you have two things that appear to correlate, you can intuitively reason that the two things are somehow connected, meaning that there is a causation between the two. For instance, say you're a YouTuber like me, and I change the banner on the front page of my channel. My views start to decrease over the next month. I then conclude that, it was after I changed the banner that my channel's views started to decrease. This must mean that the banner had a lot to do with my channel's growth. I must change the banner back to the original one post-haste. This, like with many fallacies, ignores any nuance in an actual proposition. There could be something with the style of video that I did during that month. That could be something with the amount of uploads I made during that month. It could just be the whims of the algorithm showing my content to fewer and fewer viewers. But when I reason that it must be the banner simply because it circumstantially correlates with my channel's drop in views, I've engaged in the fallacy. The Sharpshooter Fallacy. Oh, this one. I haven't actually had a chance to talk about it on my channel, but I think I can use my channel as an accurate representation of this fallacy right now. So I work full-time on YouTube. This is via a combination of the AdSense that comes in from the channel and all of my lovely viewers on Patreon. The Sharpshooter Fallacy gets its name from an anecdote about a Texan who fires his gun at a wall. After firing his gun at the wall hundreds of times, the sharpshooter then analyzes the wall. He sees that there's an area of the wall with a very tight cluster of bullets. He then paints a target around that area to make it look like he's an expert sharpshooter, even if only 20 or so rounds hit the area he drew the circle around, ignoring the hundreds of rounds that missed. To use my channel as an example for this, if I were to argue that I'm a good YouTuber and I know what I'm doing because I managed to get full time, I'd be ignoring the 4 other channels that I created that all failed leading up to making this one. I'm also ignoring the little fact that it was other YouTubers and patrons who actually lifted me up into the ability to even do this full time at all. One of the times you've personally probably seen the Sharpshooter Fallacy appealed to the most, though, is in regards to the Bible. If someone tries to argue that the Bible got many prophecies right, but ignore every other time that the Bible was wrong about prophecy, they're focusing only on the positive hits and not all the misses. They're engaging in the Sharpshooter Fallacy in order to argue that their Bible is incredibly accurate. But having a few hits ignores all the times you missed, and that's kind of the core of that fallacy. The argument to moderation. This is another one that I'm sure people who deal in politics are quite used to. This is a fallacy where one argues that the truth of the matter must always lie somewhere between the middle of two extremes. The problem is that this fallacy ignores the fact that there are some extremes that are completely and totally false, as opposed to just magnified obscurations of the truth. For instance, if there is a minority that doesn't want to be shot for being a minority and argues for harsher punishments for hate crimes as a result, and on the other side we have someone arguing that the minority should all be stripped away from the population by force so that they do not taint the gene pool, someone who appeals to the argument to moderation would say, hey, maybe the answer exists somewhere in the middle. Instead of protecting oppressed groups, why don't we try to find a compromise where minorities don't get to breed with people of the pure races, but we don't necessarily have to kill them. There's no need for protections if the problem's solved this way. This is an appeal to moderation. This is a middle ground fallacy. A middle ground between these two extremes doesn't need to exist at all. While it might be true that in an ideal scenario we shouldn't need specific hate crime laws, though in our current environment we certainly do because oppressed classes exist, the other side does not have an ounce of truth. There's no validity to a pure gene pool position. There's no validity for wanting to shoot someone just because they fall in love with someone else and decide to breed. While one stance may have a little bit of truth to it, the other stance has none. There's no reason to try to actually argue a middle ground between these two stances, simply because they're both extreme. One side can be extreme and just wrong, and the other side can be extreme, birthed merely out of a need for self-defense from the incredibly wrong, violent side. the argument from incredulity. You've probably heard this one at the water cooler or work several times. This happens when somebody has difficulty understanding how or why something is true, and then conclude that it must be false because they can't personally understand it. This is a subset of the argument from ignorance. Because you find proposition A incredulous, because you can't possibly fathom why it's true, does not suddenly make it false. For instance, if you say that the Earth can't possibly be round because you haven't personally seen any evidence that it's round, and everything looks flat to you, you are engaging in the personal incredulity fallacy. The mere fact that you can't wrap your head around a round Earth does not mean that the conclusion that the Earth is flat is somehow true. No true Scotsman! This is an incredibly fun one when dealing with various religions, usually of the Abrahamic variety. The no true Scotsman fallacy happens when somebody argues that no true person in a given group would engage in a particular action. This fallacy is usually engaged in so that somebody can deflect any accusations about a member or about their group. Let's talk about why it's called no true Scotsman. The adage goes that no true Scotsman would have sugar in his porridge. If I then tell you that my father was a true Scotsman and he put sugar in his porridge, you are then stuck in the position of trying to argue that he's not a true Scotsman. Like in the example, the criteria for an action that someone would take is arbitrarily used to be some sort of litmus test for any member of a given group. If you say Christians don't commit murder, and I give you an example of a Christian who killed 100 people, you then say, well, he wasn't a true Christian. Irregardless of the fact that a true Christian is merely someone who believes in Christ and believes in the Bible and accepts Jesus as their personal savior, you deflect any accusation about a member of your group by simply saying that he couldn't possibly be in your group. Tu quoque, or the et tu fallacy. This is one that you've heard me talk about many times on my channel. Lovingly in my head, every now and again I've called it the skeleton in the closet argument. This happens when you try to discredit an opponent by answering their criticism with criticism of them. For instance, if you say that I didn't do the dishes on Wednesday, and then I argue that, well, you didn't take out the trash on Tuesday, I am engaging in tu quoque. Whether or not you took out the trash on Tuesday doesn't change the fact that the dishes on Wednesday were my responsibility. The reason I like calling it a skeleton in the closet argument is that if you try to argue that I have skeletons in my closet, and I bite back that you have skeletons in yours, the only conclusion we've come to is that we've both got a bone to pick with each other in each other's closets. We haven't removed the skeletons, and we haven't really addressed the skeletons, we've just talked around them. So that's tu quoque. It's fun, right? The last one I want to get into is the Fallacy Fallacy. I briefly mentioned this near the beginning of the video, but I want to mention it again here. The Fallacy Fallacy is when you argue that a conclusion must be false because a fallacious argument was used in getting to the conclusion. I talked about this through the lens of the appeal to authority earlier, but I think another example could work here as well. I mentioned changing the channel banner when I talked about the correlation versus causation fallacy. If I were to conclude, because I was engaging in a fallacy, that it could not have been the channel banner, because thinking that the channel banner was responsible for my drop in views was engaging in a fallacy, then I've now committed the Fallacy Fallacy. I've used a fallacy to argue that a conclusion must be false, but the conclusion's truth or falseness exists completely independent of the reasoning used to get there. This is one you need to watch out for, because when you learn a lot of fallacies and you start learning informal logic, you might be tempted to argue that everyone around you is coming to the wrong conclusions because they're using fallacious means to get there. The fact of the matter is, though, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Due to military intelligence, once if it's military time. Someone can use improper reasoning for every argument they've ever made and still come to the right conclusion every once in a while, because the truth value of any conclusion or proposition exists completely, totally, and entirely independently of the logic you used to get to that conclusion. But I think that's all that we're going to cover today. There are many more fallacies that we can get into, but I don't want to be here for literally years. But hopefully you guys found this information useful. I'm sure a lot of you have heard me mention many of these throughout my episodes, and having a comprehensive list where I go over some of the most commonly used ones will hopefully be helpful. If there is a fallacy that you wanted me to cover, then please let me know in the comment section below, and I'll make sure that when I do a sequel to this video, I'll go over it. But with all that said, if you enjoyed, please hit the like button, share it with your friends. Patreon's always a great way to support if you really want to do that. Thank you for watching, it really means a lot to me, and as always everyone, Insert end of video tagline here.